If sugar is not the cause of visceral fat and fatty liver, what is? Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. In this video, we're going to go into visceral fat and fatty liver and see, how should I say, one person's attempt to integrate the knowledge that's out there. Tom DeLauer is a internet influencer who has helped a lot of people learn about low-carb and keto diets. And here he's going to demonstrate what a lot of researchers and people try to do, which is to bring together things that really can't be put together. And I'll tell you what I mean. Be sure to listen to the end where I give my final thoughts. Before we dive into today's video, I want to invite you to my free webinar, Beyond Cholesterol, the 2 biggest risk factors for cardiovascular disease. If you're confused by cholesterol or feeling pressured by your doctor to take cholesterol medication, this webinar is perfect for you. Discover the crucial facts about why cholesterol isn't the primary concern for cardiovascular disease risk, and learn what you should focus on instead to evaluate and lower your risk. You can sign up below.
Fatty liver is an issue with excess, period. I have no problem coming out and saying that because we have people in 2 different camps that love to fight each other about this. And candidly, personally, I find it frustrating. You have one camp that says carbohydrates are purely the problem, and that's what triggers a fatty liver. And you have another camp that says it's fat, it's excess fat consumption. That's what causes a fatty liver. You know what? Both arguments are correct. And there is a place in which they intersect. And that is what most of us are dealing with. And that is an overabundance of food and an overconsumption of hyperpalatable stuff that absorbs very fast, faster than our body can handle. And the root of metabolism is really in a lot of ways in our liver. And if we are bombarding our liver with too much in the way of nutrients in general, when I say nutrients, I mean, in this case, fat and carbs, we cause a problem.
Well, so I think what's happening is if you're not a researcher, if you're not a medically trained or physiologically trained person, you're going to be looking at research and conclusions that different camps make. As he says, camps. Well, you know, science should be able to explain everything that's going on, not being in different camps. And so, but what's curious is there's the possibility that you can't both be right. For example, if you live in a country where you drive on the right-hand side of the road, it's correct to drive on the right-hand side of the road, and it's not correct to drive on the left-hand side of the road. So if you drive in a country where you drive on the left-hand side of the road, it seems weird when you come to the US where you only drive on the right-hand side of the road. You can't do both. So what's missing here is the understanding that there are entirely different contexts, entirely different metabolisms going on when you're keto or fat burning and when you're eating carbohydrates and burning carbohydrates and not just the fat. So we're going to see Tom trying to struggle to make sense out of what really can't be brought together.
Let's investigate which one is the more likely culprit in today's society. So there was a study that was published in the journal Hepatology that took a look at 5,908 people. And it took a look at these people that were consuming either diet sodas or regular sodas over a period of time. And then they measured something that is called alanine transaminase. Now this is an enzyme that is typically elevated, almost always elevated, in people that have a fatty liver. They found the people that consumed the regular sodas, even if they roughly ate the same amount of calories as people that consumed the diet sodas, there was a higher level of alanine transaminase, meaning a higher degree of fatty liver. So this would let people think that, okay, well, sugar is the problem. It's purely the issue, and we need to reduce our sugar intake. Okay.
Well, that makes sense to me. But again, I'm on the side of the road of the people who think you need to drive on the right-hand side of the road, or on the keto metabolism side where actually it's the carbohydrates that raise the insulin level, and it's insulin that raises the issue of insulin resistance or not having insulin work as well as it should as before. So actually, we're going to actually get a clashing of paradigms here in a minute, because in fact this is a study in people who eat carbohydrates, and even then the regular sugary soft drinks or sugar sweetened beverages were associated with higher transaminases. And we'll just assume, even though transaminases can be associated with hepatitis and other issues, we'll assume that it was indicative of fatty liver in this case, even though they didn't really measure fatty liver. But so in any case, the more sugar, the more transaminase elevation, and the more fatty liver. Makes sense to me.
Well, that does make sense in a lot of ways. So let's understand how this works really quick. When we consume fructose, or when we consume sugar in general, sugar has glucose and fructose. The glucose portion of sugar goes around and it gets sucked up by our muscle cells, used as energy in the muscle cells, in the brain, whatever. The other half, the fructose, is awesome stuff, but the problem with fructose is that it has to be metabolized in the liver. So when you have an abundance of fuel and there is too much fructose and too much glucose, the liver says, okay, well, I can only store so much of this fructose. It can't go anywhere else. It can't go to muscle glycogen, so I can only store it here. If I start getting 40, 50, 60, 70 grams of fructose, well, I have to store it as fat, and it stores it in the liver, fatty liver.
Well, and I wish you would keep going there. It's not just fatty liver. Fatty liver is the place and the beginning of the export of these fats to the fat cells. So actually, fatty liver is a sign that your body is in a fat creation and fat storage mode, often with diabetes or pre-diabetes, and it means you're pushing the carbs, turning them into fat in the liver. Then they get exported on VLDLs, get measured as triglyceride in the blood, and so it's not just getting stored in fatty liver. But here, the process is correct. So extra carbs, and I prefer the term carbs, because when you get to glucose and fructose and the glucose gets sucked into the cells, well, not always. So glucose can freely get into red blood cells and white blood cells and the brain, but actually it requires insulin for glucose to get into the muscle cells. So glucose may or may not get into the cells, and fructose and glucose get turned into triglyceride or fat in the liver. That's why I prefer to use the term carbs. While it is a bit of an oversimplification, it also makes it easier to understand. Excess carbs get turned to fat in the liver, then exported to the fat cells for storage. And some of my patients, it seems, have unlimited ability to store fat in their fat cells. Just come to my obesity medicine clinic, or go to any clinic. Just go to the mall, then you'll see that the ability to store fat is pretty amazing.
So yes, that would lead us to believe that this is the sole problem, but we cannot be myopic when we look at this. We also know that fats themselves, especially saturated fats, store very easily too. Now, this is difficult for the low-carb community to hear. It was difficult for me to hear at first too, but not all fats are created equal, okay? Some fats break down pretty fast, and some fats, like saturated fats, specifically palmitic acid, that takes a long time to break down, elevating blood lipid levels for a long period of time. This can do a couple of things. These saturated fats themselves can directly go to the liver and actually store as fats, but saturated fats also impact our insulin resistance, right? So if we have high levels of saturated fat and high levels of lipids circulating through the bloodstream that are not getting oxidized fast enough because we've eaten, hey, magic words here, too much of them, guess what happens? Well, then the liver takes the brunt of the load.
Well, hang on. So did you follow that? I really didn't, because what was missing is that you have to have carbohydrates around. You have to have glucose trying to get into the insulin-dependent glucose receptor into the muscle in order for the saturated fat, if it has an effect, to have an impact on insulin resistance. So here's where the paradigm shifts and the paradigms change. Insulin resistance actually came about as a way to explain why insulin levels are high in people who have type 2 diabetes. In the book called Rethinking Diabetes, Gary Taubes tells the history of type 2 and type 1 diabetes and how at first it was not possible to know if the insulin level was high or not in those who had elevated blood glucoses or even urine glucoses it started with. So we know now type 1 diabetes is insulin deficiency. You don't have insulin at all. If you measure the insulin in the blood, it's 0. But then there were these people who were heavy, who had elevated blood glucoses. They didn't have the same issues as wasting away, requiring insulin to stay alive. When they were finally treated, they got the insulin like the type 1s. The type 2s got insulin, but that was before you could actually measure insulin levels in the blood. It wasn't until the late 1960s, early 1970s, when the radioimmunoassay came about to be able to measure insulin. And it was quite surprising that reading the paper where they first show that insulin levels are already high in those with type 2 diabetes. They basically said, like most endocrinologists would think, insulin's already high, we need to lower the insulin level, not give more insulin. See, in endocrinology, if the hormone's high, you want to do something to lower the hormone. Thyroid levels are high, cortisol levels are high, you're trying to lower the hormone. If the thyroid level is low or the cortisol level is low or insulin level is low, you want to raise the hormone. But that's not what was happening because insulin was being given to those with already high insulin levels. So the paradigm of insulin resistance is because there's something wrong in the cell that makes the insulin not work right. It could be saturated fat, it could be stored fat inside the cell that makes the insulin receptor not work. The newer paradigm, or the old paradigm looking at insulin resistance, known as metabolic syndrome, and Gerald Reaven, Dr. Reaven at Stanford talked about this for a long time, and yet very few people listened. A different paradigm, a different way to look at it is that insulin resistance is caused by excessive insulin. Yes, insulin resistance is caused by excessive insulin, which means the saturated fat idea is irrelevant because saturated fat doesn't raise insulin. Carbohydrates do. Protein a little bit, but carbohydrates a lot. So in the low-carb paradigm view, the way to reduce and eliminate insulin resistance and prediabetes and type 2 diabetes and all these other consequences that result, Alzheimer's and all these other neurodegenerative problems, you want to lower the insulin levels to lower the insulin resistance, and a very effective method is to lower the carbohydrate. So it really has nothing to do with saturated fat in this different paradigm. And you can see that Tom is trying to incorporate the old paradigm, which still a lot of people publish and say this is what's happening, saturated fats are bad in the food, you want to change the type of fats. I don't think that way at all anymore. But it took me a long time to make that change. And other researchers who are examining what happens under low-carb ketogenic metabolism.
Now here's another study that looks at saturated fat in a fatty liver. This study was published in the journal Diabetes Care. It took a look at a 4-week analysis, 4-week diet of a higher saturated fat diet versus a high sugar diet. They found the high saturated fat diet ended up leading to a 39% increase in triglycerides. That's pretty interesting because normally we would expect more sugar to trigger triglycerides, which it absolutely does. But it found that saturated fat also increased triglycerides.
Yes, but this is in the context of both diets that have lots of carbohydrates. And be careful, the shorthand is to say the high-fat diet, when it may also be high-carb. And so when you're trying to promote a certain point of view, a certain paradigm for whatever reason, you don't want to forget that under what context. So this is not in a ketogenic context. And even then, I'm thinking that saturated fat is still kind of this long tail of being vilified for actually not a great reason. And it's gotten into politics, it's gotten into food, to money, and natural fats, even saturated fats, to me, are healthy.
They also found that saturated fat ended up leading to a high postprandial glucose. Whoa, what's happening here? I thought fats slowed down the digestion of carbs. At a digestive level, they do. Okay, but if you have, once again, operative words here, too much saturated fat, the saturated fat can actually impede an insulin receptor from receiving a signal from insulin, therefore driving up glucose higher. Now, there are some studies that document that you can have a 50% increase in insulin resistance almost immediately with a high saturated fat meal along with carbohydrates.
Oh, look. So yes, when you're eating carbohydrates, but that's not what we're talking about. So if you're one of my patients, you've been instructed to keep the carbohydrates really low. You might actually be in the ultra super fat burning mode, which is a keto mode of less than 20 total carbs per day, not net. We always look at total carbs, not net carbs. Net carbs just means more carbs. And when I look at a meal like this and someone points out saturated fats in this, it's also with a lot of carbohydrates. So again, we're talking about two different paradigms. Wait, it's almost like we're in one country in a different country and we drive on other sides of the road. You can't do that in the same country and get away. Well, I don't advise it. So, and yet I've met people who have never even watched TV to know that in other countries you can actually drive on the other side of the road safely because everyone's doing it. But when you go there, it seems weird. And if you're a researcher that's only studied diets that have carbohydrates, you're going to believe this to be true because you've never gone to a different country, studied a different metabolism to see that other things happen. So this is why I don't think there's going to be any reconciliation here. It's just a different situation. That you're right in this context, you're right in that context.
And what do we typically eat in today's society? We don't typically. Okay, I mean, I'm sure there's people out there, but when you look at a lot of obese people, they're not eating just Skittles and jelly beans and like pure sugar, Skittles, jelly beans, and sodas, right? No, they're eating these high sugar things along with high fat foods, right?
Well, okay, now we're talking about, I hope not you, or if you are still eating the typical American diet, I think he has it all wrong. The most important thing is the carbs, not the fats. The country has done a great job of reducing the fats over time, and it hasn't helped with even public health. So I disagree. The number one issue here, even if you're eating a mixed diet, meaning carbohydrates, fats, and protein, is the carbs, not the saturated fat. And I wonder if, because Tom is not a researcher, he's now trying to appease, if you will, or accommodate all this different research to make, how should I say, make it seem reasonable to everybody. He's not going to be likely to say, no, in this context, that's not true, because maybe there's more at stake. Maybe he doesn't understand the different metabolism to the level that other researchers do.
So maybe they're having some jelly beans and a soda, but they're also eating fried chicken and donuts, right? So you're getting fats and sugars combined, where you're having an overage of sucrose, fructose, and glucose.
So when he says fried chicken and donuts, I think carbs. I don't think saturated fats. And that was fascinating. When I went to a nutrition program that was measuring what people eat, they say they eat certain things. When they heard something like a donut, they categorized it as a high saturated fat food. So looking through the blinders of a donut is a high saturated fat food. Well, it also has carbohydrates in it. So you can't just simplify something like a donut into high saturated fat. Same with like the burger and the fries. It's not just the saturated fat. It also carries lots of carbohydrate with it.
And you're also having a huge amount of saturated fat. So guess what's happening? Okay, so now you have saturated fat that is directly impeding, and I hate to say it, and I know you don't want to hear it, but saturated fat does impact insulin resistance still if you have too much of it. So saturated fat impacting the insulin receptor. So now you have more circulating glucose.
Yeah, so he's making it too complicated. Let's take the extreme case of if you just had carbohydrates. Well, and you know, I understand, and he's right, it's an excessive amount of it There are some people who can just limit what they eat. They're very rare in my clinic, but they exist. But if you have just carbohydrates going in, it's not going to be healthy, but you're going to be at risk of higher blood glucoses and insulin resistance, because the insulin goes up as a result of the dietary carbohydrate and the blood glucose going up. Now let's take the other case of just the saturated fat. So in the context of a low-carb diet where you're just having saturated fats, your insulin resistance will go down when you're not having the carbohydrates, because the carbohydrates raise the insulin, raising the insulin raises the insulin resistance in this paradigm view. So just having saturated fat will not cause insulin resistance unless you're having carbohydrates as well. And that, prove me wrong, but I don't think anyone's actually done that sort of study. The closest we've done is a super low carb, a protein and a saturated fat type of paradigm. And what happens is you start burning the fat that you eat. You don't have fat going around in the blood. Your fat levels actually go down on a low carb, high fat diet when you're burning fat really well. I know that's not going to make sense at first. You have to think about that, but when you're burning fat, you're going to have less fat going around in the blood. So again, I don't agree.
That glucose then has to go to the liver. It has to go through de novo lipogenesis and get converted into fat. Well, oh shoot, already at that same time, unfortunately, the liver's also dealing with a copious amount of fructose that's come in from the 200 grams of high fructose corn syrup that was just consumed. You see where I'm going with this?
Well, I agree with him. Don't do that. Don't. So if it helps you to be a conciliator, a diplomat, which I often try to be, to say, okay, those people are right and these people are right. Yeah, sure, you can drive on the right-hand side of the road, drive on the left-hand side of the road in different countries. That's fine. But I think the mistaken emphasis on saturated fat is a problem, because it has not caused a reduction or elimination of type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance in population settings at all. It's the wrong focus. We need to focus on reducing the sugar and reducing the carbohydrates.
Because the saturated fat has made the liver more sensitive to the impacts of fructose and glucose, then, not necessarily only then, but then you really see an exacerbated response. And it makes it look like glucose and fructose and sugar is the pure problem. It is a huge part of the problem, do not get me wrong. But the saturated fat arm is playing a huge role too. So is it one or the other? No, it is both. But I can tell you that by reducing one or the other, you can cause a positive impact. So don't get upset over the fact that it could be saturated fat that's the problem. It could be sugar that's the problem. Guess what? You don't have to reduce both. You should maybe reduce both. But if you reduce just one of them, you'd probably make a positive impact. So here's my playbook for you. Okay, with saturated fat, less than 20% of your total calories from fat should be saturated fat.
Yeah, no. That's the old paradigm. And it really didn't help reduce type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and the whole saturated fat vilification needs to just fade away. It's too bad Tom's bringing this up. The researchers in a paper led by Arnie Astrup and Jeff Volek, who's the US researcher at Ohio State, basically said saturated fat is not a problem. It's not a cause for concern. The metabolism doesn't impact the diabetes or heart disease for that matter. So it's too bad that he's still, I think he's trying to make amends, trying to be kind to both camps, because he's not an MD, he's not a researcher, and he's going to try to appease both. If he gets criticized by one group, he's going to try to say, well, okay, you're right, and criticized by another, okay, you're right, when it's easy for me to just kind of say, well, the science doesn't support that view anymore. Don't limit your saturated fats.
If you eat 100 grams of fat per day, no more than 20 grams of it should be saturated. Now, if you increase your amounts of monounsaturated fats, things like pork is rich in monounsaturated fat, macadamia nuts, monounsaturated fat, olive oil, avocado oil, this can actually increase insulin sensitivity. The more you replace the saturated fats with the mono and the polyunsaturated, the stronger your insulin response will be. Now, with carbohydrates, the best way that we can mitigate this, You don't need to just cut out all the sugar out of your life, although that would probably be great. If you increase fiber, then you offset that. So magically, by changing the saturated fat and the types of fats you consume and adding some fiber into the diet, things start to come together. And then you might start seeing a positive impact on that alanine transaminase level and the fatty liver. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah, well, that's my final thoughts. Yes, it is too much energy. It's excess energy intake that creates the body going to raise insulin levels, and it's going to turn the body into a fat making and fat storage sort of metabolism. So that I totally agree with. The emphasis being more on carbs than on fat, I think, is the important emphasis. So especially if you're in a low carb sort of eating context, a dietary pattern, especially if you're keto, don't worry about the saturated fats at all. You're going to be eating foods that aren't as tasty. You're going to burn the fat that you eat. Of course, you're going to be burning the fat on your body as well. If you have extra fat on your body that you're trying to lose, that's why it's known as a weight loss diet. But you don't have to worry about that type of fat when you're eating a keto diet. I disagree. I hope that you find this helpful, and I hope I've clarified a few things for you. Please like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and I'm dropping new videos on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.